Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be conducting a case study on the first widely publicized report of alien abduction in the United States. The story is about the Hills, who claim to have been abducted by aliens one late night on their way home. So, without further ado, let's dive in. Barney and Betty Hill were an American couple who lived in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Barney was employed by the United States Postal Service while Betty was a social worker. The Hills were active in their local Unitarian congregation, members of the NAACP, and community leaders. Barney also sat on the local board of the United States Commission on Civil Rights. On the night of September 19, 1961, the Hills would have a night they would never forget. The Hills were driving back to Portsmouth from a vacation in Niagara Falls and Montreal. It was a typical night until around 10:30 p.m. While Barney drove, Betty observed the night sky until something unusual began occurring right in front of her. She spoke with rationality, explaining to Barney she believed she was seeing a falling star. That was, until the star began moving upward. The object moved erratically and seemed to grow bigger and brighter. Betty urged Barney to pull the car over for a closer look at the object. Barney stopped at a picnic area south of Twin Mountain. Betty peered through binoculars at the object and observed that it was an odd-shaped craft and had multicolored lights. Betty immediately told Barney that they were witnessing a flying saucer, while Barney remained skeptical. Regardless, they didn't want to stick around to find out, so they retreated back to the car. The drive continued toward Franconia Notch, a narrow road that navigated through the mountains. They drove the isolated road slowly to continue to observe the object from a distance, except the object was only moving closer to them. Betty observed and guessed that the craft was at least 1.5 times the length of the granite cliff profile, which was 40 feet long. The Hills looked on as the silent, illuminated craft bounced back and forth in the night sky. 1 mile south of Indian Head, the Hills claimed the object descended towards their vehicle. This prompted Barney to stop the car in the middle of the highway. The craft hovered approximately 80 to 100 feet above the Hills' vehicle, and it filled the entire field of view in the windshield. Barney stepped from the vehicle with a pistol in tow and the binoculars to observe the craft closer. Upon closer inspection, Barney realized peering out of the craft's windows were 8 to 11 humanoid figures all staring at him. In unison, all but one of the figures moved to the panel on the rear wall of the hallway that encircled the front portion of the craft. The one remaining figure continued staring and communicated a message to Barney stating, "Stay where you are and keep looking." The figures were described as wearing glossy black uniforms and black capes. Red lights on what appeared to be bat-wing fins began to telescope out of the sides of the craft, and a long structure descended from the bottom of the craft. Barney ran back towards Betty and in a panic yelled, "They're going to capture us." The craft again shifted its location to directly above the vehicle. Without hesitation, the Hills sped away from the scene. Betty continued to look out for the craft and rolled her windows down to better view the sky. Almost immediately, the Hills heard a rhythmic series of beeping and buzzing sounds which seemed to bounce off the trunk of their car. The car vibrated and a tingling sensation passed through their bodies. They then experienced the onset of an altered state of consciousness that left their minds dulled. A second series of the sounds returned the couple to full consciousness. They found that they had traveled nearly 35 miles south but had only vague memories of this section of the road. They arrived home at dawn, but they continued to have odd sensations and impulses they couldn't explain, such as Betty insisting the luggage be kept near the back door rather than the main part of the house. Their watches quit working and wouldn't work again. The leather strap for the binoculars was snapped, but Barney didn't know why. The toes of his best dress shoes were scraped, with no recollections of the events that caused it. The couple then went to bed as if nothing happened. Betty awoke after a few hours and placed her clothing from the drive in her closet and noticed her dress was torn in 3 different sections. It had not been in this condition prior to the drive. The car was also observed, and on the trunk there were shiny concentric circles that had not been there the previous day. On September 21st, Betty telephoned Peace Air Force Base to report the UFO encounter. Though fear of being labeled eccentric, she withheld details. Major Paul Henderson would interview the couple for details. Henderson's report determined the Hills probably misidentified Jupiter, and the report was forwarded to Project Blue Book, the U.S. Air Force UFO research project. Within days of the encounter, Betty would borrow a UFO book from the library that was written by a retired Marine, Major Donald Keyhole. Betty wrote Keyhole and recounted the entire encounter and claimed to be considering hypnosis to help fill in the gaps of lost time they experienced. Keyhole would forward the letter to Walter Webb, a Boston astronomer, who would then conduct a 6-hour interview with the Hills on October 21, 1961. During the interview, they relayed all they could remember. Barney asserted he had developed a mental block due to him not wanting to remember what occurred during the encounter. 10 days after the alleged encounter, Betty began having a series of vivid dreams that continued for 5 consecutive nights. She claimed she never recalled such detail and intensity before, but after the 5th night, the dreams would stop. Betty mentioned them to her husband, who was sympathetic but not concerned with what she was experiencing. In order to retain what she saw, Betty began to write down her dreams. One dream, she and Barney encountered a roadblock and men surrounded their car. She then lost consciousness and struggled to regain it. She realized she was being forced by 2 men to walk into the forest at night. Barney was behind her, and both seemed to be in a trance-like state. The men stood between 5 foot to 5'4" and wore matching blue uniforms with caps similar to military cadets. They appeared human with black hair, dark eyes, prominent noses, bluish lips with grayish skin. The men walked the hills up a ramp into a disc-shaped craft of metallic appearance. Once inside, the Hills were separated and taken into separate rooms. A man then entered Betty's room who was similar to the others, who she called the Examiner. He had a pleasant and calm manner. Though they spoke in English, the Examiner's command of the language seemed imperfect, and she had difficulty understanding him. The Examiner told Betty he would conduct a few tests to note the differences between humans and the beings. She was sat in a chair and bright lights were shone on her. The Examiner cut off some of her hair and checked her eyes, ears, mouth, teeth, throat, and hands. He saved trimmings from her fingernails. After examining her legs and feet, he used a dull knife to scrape off some of her skin. He then tested her nervous system by thrusting a needle into her navel, which caused agonizing pain. This was then cured by the Examiner with just a wave of his hand. The leader then entered the room and engaged in conversation with her. Betty picked up a book with strange symbols, and the leader told her she could have it. She also asked about where the beings were from. The leader pulled out an instructional map dotted with stars. The men then escorted the Hills from the ship, where a disagreement happened between the men. The leader informed Betty she could not have the book due to the Examiner not wanting the Hills to remember the encounter. Betty insisted that no matter what they did, she would remember one way or another. The men took them to the car and were told to leave when the craft departed, which they did, and then they continued their drive. Betty would have this series of dreams for 5 days, believing she was remembering exactly what occurred during the loss of time. On January 4, 1964, the Hills began undergoing hypnosis sessions through referral by their psychologist. The sessions continued until June 6 of 1964. Each of their sessions were conducted separately. During Barney's hypnosis, he recalled driving the car away, but afterwards felt irresistibly compelled to pull off the road and drive into the woods. Eventually, 6 men standing in the dirt road came into view, and 3 of them approached the car and asked Barney to not fear them and close his eyes. The beings were described similar to Betty's hypnotic recollection, which varied from her dreams. He stated both he and Betty were taken into the disc-shaped craft where they were separated. Barney went to a room and was placed on an exam table. His narrative was much less detailed, which Barney explains he continued to keep his eyes closed for most of the process. He had a general exam much like Betty described in her dream. Barney also recounted the being spoke in a mumbling language he couldn't understand, yet he also understood them in English. The few times the beings communicated with him, it was through telepathy. Betty and Barney both reported the being's mouth did not move when they communicated. Then Barney says they were escorted back to the car, and in a daze he remembers the ship leaving before driving off. Betty's accounts under hypnosis were similar to her dreams about the abduction, but there were also notable differences. The beings had a different physical appearance, and the technology in the craft differed as well. The memories from the Hills in hypnotic regression were consistent with one another. Simon, the man who conducted the hypnosis, gave Betty a suggestion post-session. He asked her to sketch the star map that was shown by the leader. Betty was able to draw up a sketch. Though the original had many stars, Betty only drew those that stood out in her memory. Her map consisted of 12 prominent stars connected by lines and 3 lesser ones that formed a distinct triangle. She explains the leader told her the stars connected by the solid lines formed the trade routes, where the dashed lines were to less traveled stars. After the hypnosis sessions, Simon speculated Barney's recollection of the encounter was a possible fantasy inspired by Betty's dreams. Barney rejected this. He claimed the statements were consistent, but each had their own unique properties, and now Barney truly believed they were abducted. The Hills would return to their regular lives and were willing to discuss the encounter with friends, family, and the occasional UFO researcher, but never appeared publicly. In 1966, John Fuller would write a book about the encounter called The Interrupted Journey, and in 1975 a TV movie was created called The UFO Incident. Betty continued to claim she saw more UFOs after the initial encounter and became a celebrity in the UFO community. Barney would pass away from a cerebral hemorrhage on February 25, 1969 at the age of 46, and Betty would pass away from cancer on October 17, 2004 at the age of 85. Many believe the Hills story and take it as being the first publicized alien abduction in U.S. history, but there are also many who theorize this event was nothing more than a fabrication. A psychiatrist would later suggest the abduction was a hallucination brought on by the stress of being an interracial couple in the 1960s. Betty discounted these claims, stating the relationship was happy and it caused no notable problems among their social groups. A skeptical blogger noted the hypnosis sessions occurred over months, which afforded the Hills plenty of time to discuss the encounter. He concluded the tale is unsupported by any useful evidence and is perfectly consistent with natural explanations. He explains the analysis of the timeline of the 2 Air Force sightings from the night in Project Blue Book shows that neither correlated with the Hills story. Another researcher suggested the revealed memories were influenced by an episode of a TV show called The Outer Limits, which was broadcast about 2 weeks before Barney's first hypnosis session. The report from the regression featured a scenario that was in some respects similar to the TV show. The same reporter also pointed out that some motifs from the Hills accounts were present in the 1953 film Invaders from Mars. Jim McDonald, a resident in the area in which the Hills claimed to be abducted, produced a detailed analysis of their journey. He concluded that the episode was provoked by misperceiving an aircraft warning beacon on Cannon Mountain as a UFO. He noted the road they took, the beacon appears and disappears exactly at the same time the Hills described the UFO appearing and disappearing. The remainder of the experience is ascribed to stress, sleep deprivation, and false memories recovered under hypnosis. Regardless, the recounted events that happened to the Hills is a fascinating tale. The Hills were prominent members in their community and only had their reputation to lose by coming forward. But it's truly difficult to determine the facts from fiction. I'll leave that open for you to decide. Did the Hills truly experience an alien abduction? Hey guys, thanks for watching. I went a different direction this week and I hope you guys enjoyed the content. It was an interesting story that I could not pass up on the opportunity to share with everyone. So what do you think? Were the Hills truly abducted, or did they just make this whole thing up? Let me know your thoughts. And as always, guys, thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!